We are, we have 2 more sessions tonight. We have in 2 weeks. What I'd like to do is try to outline what we're going to do on both of those sessions. The hope is that the final session will be at Sinai. Not Mount Sinai, but well, that will actually be fine.
That's a field trip.
It'll be at Mount Sinai. For sure, we will let you know about a week before whether we can actually be there or not. If not, then we'll be back here for the final session.
And then we'll party when you're done.
And we'll party, yeah, right, exactly. Okay, you have the outline for tonight. I want you to do one thing while we're teaching tonight, and that is, and that is, I have a feeling that there are probably other questions that have come up in the first 4 or 5 sessions that we're doing. Know what they are, or if you have them, either write them on a little piece of paper, or at the end or during the break, tell us what some of those issues are that still need to be talked about. Our hope is that tonight we'll finish most of what we wanted to share with you folks. And then next time we meet, we'll go into the practical aspects of how we're going to do all of this stuff.
Do you have more of the handouts that I saw reading them?
The pink one?
You can get them here.
Oh, the purple.
Thank you. Pink,
Okay.
purple, whatever
Pink,
you want
purple,
to call it.
whatever you want to call it.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to start out this evening looking at what I refer to as one of the foundational Hever Kadisha texts. It comes from Moed Katan, and I want to say a few words about Moed Katan before we look at the actual text, because that's where most of what Talmud has to say, a very large part of what Talmud has to say about our issues, is in that tractate. Moed Katan is about the intermediate days of the festivals. Doesn't, on the face of it, have anything to do with mourning and death and so on. But there's a conflict during that time between the joy of the festival and the potential issue of mourning. And so the tractate uses that as a jumping off point for dealing with a whole range of issues around mourning and so on. There's a wonderful piece of work that was done by one of my Gamliel Institute colleagues, Isaac Pollack, who went through all of Moed Katan and pulled out all of the pieces that relate to Hever Kadisha issues. And I don't know where exactly that's available to anybody that doesn't know one of us, but someday. So among the things that Moed Katan says, in passing around these issues, is that if a man's wife dies and he doesn't have children, he can remarry immediately so that he can have children. If he's left with small children, he can remarry immediately so they can have a mother. Sexist, but true to its time. There's a piece that says that we rend the garment of a minor because of grief. And what Rashi explains is that doesn't mean that the child is in grief, but that other people should look and see this poor child with a torn garment and that they should be moved to tears out of the emotionality of seeing this poor orphaned little one, and that the grief of everybody around adds to the kavod, the honor for the deceased. Rabbi Yochanan says those who console a mourner are not allowed to speak until the mourner begins. We've talked about that, I think. He also said that a mourner, once he nods his head, the comforters are no longer permitted to sit beside him. That's his signal to say, enough. He's got some control over how hemmed in by comfort is he is. And Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, anyone who grieves over his dead to excess will weep for another deceased. Don't overdo it. If you want to grieve, we'll give you grief. But so don't ask for more. Okay, so those are some of just a sample of the kinds of things that Moed Katan has. And now I want to look at this text. Does everybody have a copy of this sort of pink, purple, whatever you want to call that color, piece of paper? And maybe we can just have people read. I want to read the first 3 paragraphs, and then we're going to jump. There's a bunch that I've left out, so it goes on, but I think the first 3 will give us, if you'll read the first paragraph, and then just.
Originally, when they delivered food to a house of mourning, the wealthy received their mourner's meal in baskets of silver and gold, while poor people received theirs in baskets of willow twigs, and the poor would feel ashamed. The rabbis instituted that all should receive their mourner's meal in baskets of willow twigs, out of concern for the honor of the poor.
Originally, when they served drinks in a house of mourning, the wealthy did so in white glassware, and the poor in colored glassware.
So the assumption here is that colored glassware was cheaper.
And the poor would feel ashamed. The rabbis instituted that all should serve in colored glassware out of concern for the honor of the poor.
Originally, they would leave uncovered the faces of the wealthy who had died, while they would cover the faces of the poor, for their faces were blackened by famine, and the poor would feel ashamed. The rabbis instituted that they should cover the faces of all, out of concern for the honor of the poor. And
there are a couple more here, and as I said, there are 2 or 3 I think that I left out, just didn't want to fill the page, but there are more. They go on, and the rabbis instituted da-da-da-da-da-da. And then we get to the next to last paragraph. Who's our next reader?
Originally, the expense of burying the deceased was even harder on his relatives than his death, to the point that his relatives would leave him and flee, until Rabban Gamliel came and treated himself lightly by leaving instructions that he be buried. Following his example, people were buried subsequently in plain linen garments.
Okay, so this notion of treating himself lightly was he didn't stand on ceremony. He didn't decide, I'm a big shot, I deserve all the fanciest stuff. That's what they mean by treated himself lightly. And I don't think we need to read the last one right now, but I have a couple of comments about that. One is, the first bunch of paragraphs all say, the rabbis came and instituted, the rabbis came and instituted. They didn't seem to act here. I'm very distressed that they saw this happening and they didn't step in and say, wait a minute, we, the rabbis, need to institute some other practice. Be that as it may, Rabban Gamliel did, and it is from his example that we get, our principle of equality in death, of simplicity in burial, and so on. So what are our lessons? Simple, identical shrouds for everyone. Unadorned caskets. The responsibility of the community. If people were leaving their dead on the street, and running away because they were so embarrassed, that's not working. And the rabbis representing the community had to intervene and say, wait a minute. Intervened and said, wait a minute, this doesn't work. We need to establish a communal standard that works for everybody. And since he couldn't force the poor to live up to the standard of the rich, he said, okay, the rich are going to have to live down to the standard of the poor and do it the simplest possible way. I think we've heard here in one of the earlier sessions, sign a memorial guarantees that nobody goes without a burial for lack of funds. Sign a memorial guarantees that children get free burials. They are a loss, their death is a loss to the whole community. And so the whole community needs to pitch in and take care of them. Any comments or questions about the text? And the very last piece about the shrouds. Rav Papa said, nowadays it is the custom of people even to use shrouds of cheap canvas worth just a zuz. Simple shrouds. Questions? Comments? So I think this is one of two or three what we generally think of as sort of the foundational texts for the broad principles that we have in Sefer Kadisha. I think we mentioned the one of Rabbi Hamnuna, the earliest example we have of a Sefer Kadisha, where he comes to a town and he hears that there's been a death, and people are going about their business, and he says, "This is no good, I excommunicate you all." And they say, "No, we have a group that deals with this." He says, "Oh, okay, no excommunication." Okay.
So we want to go on to just a quick review of Jewish practices, which is letter B on the outline, and we'll take some time, just a little bit of time for questions on each of them if there are any. But I wanted to have this in everybody's consciousness, because please remember that the work of the Sefer Kadisha extends well beyond Tahara and Shmirah. And so we're going to see how this plays out in each of the synagogues so that we can make sure that these areas are covered by the work in each of the synagogues.
So there's a sequence of more or less chronological order of pieces of the big picture. And it starts with Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. The rabbis place great stress on the obligation of Bikur Cholim and the obligation when you are visiting the sick to pray on behalf of the sick person. Whether it's a Mishaberach formal prayer or a spontaneous prayer, and I've talked a little bit about things you can say that are just straight from your heart, off the top of your head, asking for healing of whatever kind may be appropriate. The rabbis say that each visit removes 1/60th of the illness. Now, you might think, oh, I just need to have 60 people visit me and I'll be fine. 60th sort of cumulatively. So if I've got 60 units of illness and the first person removes a 60th, that's 1 unit gone. But then there's only 59, and so the next person removes a slightly less. It's 1/60th of what's remaining, and then 1/60th of what's remaining from that. So it's sort of,
Rabbi Zeno.
yes,
Asymptotic.
Asymptotic, yes. So, but you can get it way, way down if you just have enough visitors.
You should all know that Dan's PhD is in math.
Okay, so that's Bikur Cholim.
So, Vidui, depending on what Siddur you look at, it might be called the deathbed confession, it might be called the deathbed supplication. But it's important to remember that there are other times that Vidui also fits into our liturgy, certainly notably on Yom Kippur. Some people also recite a version of the Vidui at bedtime as part of the bedtime Shema. Some people do it during their daily prayers. I have a dear friend who's a rabbi who was called to the bedside of his elderly aunt who her eyes were closed and she was unresponsive, and everybody thought that she was near death, and so he was called and invited to offer the vidui on her behalf. And he came to her bedside with great gravitas and leaned over to her, and she opened her eyes and said, "Not yet." But this is a very common misconception that because one says the vidui at the bedside of somebody who appears to be dying, this is no need for superstition. If the vidui is said that person will die, so I always think it's good to err on the side of caution when especially speaking with God about things like asking for forgiveness. And there's a very beautiful part of the vidui which is speaking to God and saying, I realize that whether I live or die is not up to me, it's up to you. So there are many different versions of the I'll say the deathbed vidui, looking at different siddurim and seeing the language. It's very poetic, and there's also a lot of variations. It's a bit like El Malay Rachamim in that sense, where there's not one set formula for the vidui. So, but it has to do with asking for forgiveness and the understanding that, you know, I am an imperfect person who has lived an imperfect life, but I want to go back pure.
Is that something that only an ordained rabbi would
No,
ever do?
absolutely
Or
not.
can anyone
Absolutely.
who's volunteering
Yeah.
or a
Right.
close friend can do that with someone?
That's right. You know, if a person is able to say it for themselves, I would say so much the better. But someone else can say it on behalf of a person to be dying.
It's also interesting that at the end of, we Jews have a whole, we're not afraid to use words, but it's interesting that in all of the liturgy, at end of life prayers seem to be absent. There are viduis. I'm going to read one for you that I'd like to just share, but there are no prayers that we put into people's mouths to offer them words to say goodbye to somebody. There are no prayers that I now know of, some modern ones, to be said by a doctor, nurse, who's been with this person and who needs to say goodbye. That whole literature, it seems to me, is quite absent. There's a friend of mine, Allison Jordan is her name. She has a website called Vidui Variations. And in it are a bunch of different versions of variations that Holly was just talking about. But there's also some other prayers in there that are really quite interesting. For example, how do you really say goodbye to somebody who's dying? To someone with whom you've had a painful relationship. Listen to what she wrote. This is her version. My God and God of the generations of my people, I'm distressed and confused. During my lifetime, I've experienced misunderstanding, hurt, and harm in my relationship with so-and-so who is dying or has died. Though I've sought help and understanding, I've not found peace nor recovered from painful experiences and memories. I have been unable to forgive so-and-so. Neither have I found the ways to forgive myself for my own confusion, anger, and suffering. Some days I feel no hope for connection and reconciliation. This is a painful passage. I have no answers, but my questions cry out. How can I approach this period of mourning? How shall I mark this death? How can I feel my obligation as a whatever to one who has been a source of my grief? How can I feel solace in my community if I feel different from other mourners? Without a community, where will I find my help? With whom can I share this particular pain? How can I be most true to myself for my own sake? What do I need at this time? From a place of narrowness, I cry out, please free me. Breathe into me the breath of healing spaciousness. So that whole literature is pretty sparse. But these are some attempts at them. And it's now being sort of, a lot of it is being put in the category of vidui, even though it's really not. It's another category, but it doesn't fit anywhere because there's no tradition of those kind of prayers.
And the whole issue of saying a eulogy for somebody with whom you had a very troubled, very conflicted around what level of truth to put out there.
Is there lack of another way of expressing it, vidui follow-up? You know, I can see somebody saying what you just read, Sue, and the person dies, what do you do with it the next day? I mean, you can't feel absolved by just making a statement. I don't think I would. Those are like,
Yeah, that at least to the level of consciousness, what the person is feeling. What they do with it afterwards, I don't know.
Find a therapist.
A therapist or a rabbi or a good friend. You know?
We were teasing before class about things they didn't teach us in rabbinical school. And hearing you share that powerful thing that makes the intent behind Vidui real. So this may be more of an offline, but I actually think for the whole group to hear it is important. What about pieces of the Vidui that you don't feel right saying?
Okay.
The line, may my death be atonement for my wrongs.
Right. Okay. First of all, the first thing I would suggest is to actually study the words of the traditional Vidui. What she's done, this is an article that she and I wrote a few years ago, which contains some of the versions. That's also a very traditional person, and you may have heard in that piece that I just read hints at traditional liturgy. We've been talking about, she and I have been talking about translating some of this back into Hebrew, because a lot of it is pulled from there. She's written other ones. There's one here that's written as a humanist. There is absolutely no mention of God. There's another written to be said, how can I say this? When you do a vidui, usually you do it with an individual. Well, you can also do this saying goodbye with a whole group of people. So there's one that's antiphonal, back and forth. There are different versions that are all around now that deal with some of the questions that the traditional version deals with, or raises.
Stu, if I might also throw in, I balked at that very thing that you're saying about, my death being an atonement. I don't feel like death is a punishment or that I've flunked somehow, and so I also wrote an interpretation of the Vidui, and what I came up with on the concept of kaparah was something to the effect of what happened in this lifetime stays in this lifetime, and a little bit like burying the hatchet. Sure. It's like whatever I did that didn't work, I'm leaving it with my body, and what's going back is my soul, which was given to me pure.
Yeah. That's always been my kavanah, although there's part of me that would love to change the words a little bit too, and I've always been reticent to do that.
Might be worth trying.
Yeah, there are different traditional versions of it also, so it's not like one is Kodesh.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, was there another question back there?
Yeah, this may be too far afield, but what I had as you were reading it, I have some relatives, it's a brother and sister, who don't talk to each other. It's a very bad relationship. And some of us in the family have tried to think of what we could do. And my thought was, is there a way to use this at this time to kind of say, you don't want to be at the end of things and not be able to do it? Can you use this to resolve things today while there's still time?
Sure. You can also modify it. I mean, change it to fit the situation. Clearly, there are some blank spaces in there. What if it's a case of abuse? Or father and child, or whatever. So feel free also. I mean, all of this is public. It's public on the website, and go for it.
One more question.
I just want to be mindful that we have to be careful about who the vidui is for in the moment that we're saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The way that it's written in like the manuals is that it's for the person who has already passed or is dying. But oftentimes the people who need the vidui are the people who are living. And what it is that they're asking for forgiveness for, or perhaps kaparah for, or whatever word you want to use it for. And even the nature of the liturgy that you use is oftentimes most impactful when you draw it from them. This moment, rather than me giving you a liturgy to follow, and then using their words or their kavanot or their whatnot to be able to then craft your own in the moment. Sometimes it's the people who are living that need to make the confessional, right, about the nature of that relationship. And so being able to lift both of those pieces in that moment, giving kavod lamet, but also almost a sense of a different form depending on the nature of the relationship, is equally important.
Yeah, I was using the rubric of saying goodbye for that for the survivors, not for the person who's dying. But
I think the challenge that the language of vidui in and of itself is something that we most resonate with or connect with Yom Kippur. Right, where we're actually doing a confessional. Even the confessional in that case is communal more so than it is personal. And so that language of vidui doesn't always resonate in that particular context.
Exactly.
So there's a whole lot to unpack.
Good.
So continuing in the time sequence, Bikur Cholim, Vidui, Taharan, Shmirah. So person has died. We've got these two things. I think we've talked enough about them to don't need to go into any detail. Just the sort of in-between rituals that mark the shift in the Chevra Kadishas and the community's focus from the deceased to the mourner. Instant of time when that shift takes place is when the body is put in the ground. Up until then, primary significance is for the deceased. And once the body is in the ground, our shift, our focus moves to the mourner primarily. And if there's a conflict of interest between the two, it moves from the interest of the deceased to the interest of the mourner.
Good. So we distributed these last time. For those of you that didn't get, we have some more. I just want to remind everybody that this was written not for the mourner. This is written for the person who is, and this is written for the person who comes to a funeral, because it was my feeling that the only time that is the appropriate educational time when you could talk to people. Anyone else? When you could talk to people about death and mourning and funerals is when they show up at a funeral. And I wanted it this pocket size, venture size, so you would stick it in your pocket and you would take it home. That's why we did it, and it's written by Dan and myself and Jason Moiner, who's an Orthodox rabbi in Los Angeles. So we pretty much have our bases covered. And what it does, and I hope you've read it, it takes you through what happens. It just takes you through, walks a person through, so that in that awkward moment, or moments, when you walk into a funeral, and before things start, when people are not quite sure of what's happening, and all of a sudden, sometimes you get this sense of, oh, I haven't seen you in so long. One of the hopes was people would start reading this instead of having that kind of a greeting atmosphere, party atmosphere. Any questions, or I hope people have read this, taken a look at it? Yes? Yeah. Okay. All right.
Meal of condolence.
Oh, hero.
It is? Meal of condolence? Oh, well, okay. So Nechama, again, I'm not sure I have anything more to say. That's, we've had the funeral, and now we have to pay attention to the mourners. The main principle here is to listen. If you are doing that with full kavanah to hear, then you're doing it properly. I mentioned before, Rabbi Yochanan says you can't speak until the mourner begins. And he also said the mourner can say, enough. And then we have Shiva. We've got the week of Shiva. We have the Shiva Minyanim and so on, the meal of condolence, and again, the responsibility of the community. The rabbis say that the food that is eaten when the family comes back from the grave is to be food provided by the community. If there was food before, the mourners are not to eat that food. They are to eat only food provided by the community. It's not a party. That goes without saying. And then we move on to the later developments, Shloshim, the first year, the art site, and so on. But those are those steps that are the basic calendar of mourning.
One of the most profound stories I've ever heard about, walking into a Shiva house, because it's also very hard to know what to say when you walk in. Was a very simple story. This person, colleague, was traveling with somebody and got to the place, and they were both going to go to this house in the morning, and the one person knew the mourner, the other didn't. So they both sat down, and as they sat down, and it was clear that it was okay to speak, the colleague who did not know the other person said one very simple sentence. He said, "Tell me about so-and-so." That was it. And that opened up the whole way of entering into conversation with the mourner and letting the mourner talk. The conversation went on. And it was just the easiest, in a sense, one of the easiest ways of, so is hugging. Okay.
So, meal of consolation.
Yeah, he's good.
So the meal of consolation, in your little books here, on page 24, there's a description of it. You don't necessarily need to go there now, but again, it's up to the community to provide the food for the mourner. I remember when my father, blessed memory, passed away, and my friends came to the house, and I was sitting on the floor and looking around the room and saying to them, if this is a Shiva Minyan, I must be a mourner. And it really, after everything that I'd been through, the fact that he had died hadn't really struck me on a visceral level until I was back home in my community looking around my circle of friends. And one of them asked me if I would like a glass of water, and I started to decline. And then I realized that it was my responsibility to receive the nurturing of the community. And so I said, "Oh, yes, thank you." And she went and got me a glass of water. And that was many, many years ago. And I still remember so clearly that moment when she went to the kitchen and came out with one of my glasses and offered me this glass of water. The simplest things, the ways in which we really show someone that we care about them are so important. And again, as Dan was saying, as Stu was saying, this is not a party. This is a time when we are coming to really hold the mourners in the collective arms of the community, bringing particular kinds of food. The only thing I could swallow was one of those eggs. I would go in the refrigerator for days afterwards and pick up just a half an egg and was able to receive that kind of nourishment. And it's also important at the meal of consolation and also the Shiva Minyanim to know when it's time to leave. I know sometimes in our community, you know, there's a tendency to everybody's happy to see one another, and it's easy to forget why we're there. And it's important necessarily sometimes to have somebody who is, you know, gently ushering people out the door when it's obvious that the mourners need their space. So attending to these kinds of things is very important.
Comments, questions? Okay. I spent a while trying to figure out whether I should distribute these books or not. And then I decided to do that. This is a book called Health and Safety Precautions for Tahara. The reason why I didn't want to do it is because sometimes when you get, I decided obviously to do it. I decided to do it because, for a couple of reasons. When you look, it seems to me that, first of all, one of the things that people say to me very often, and I felt also before I did Tahara, was, what am I really getting into? What are the dangers of possible contamination, disease, accidents? What are those possibilities that might happen while I walk into a Tahara room? And I realized that, nobody before I did my first one, no one before I did my first one really said to me, well, here's some of the things that you really got to be careful of and you have to do. So this booklet hopefully will relieve some anxiety. It might create some. It might create some, but just take it as a, I want you to open up to the table of contents. Please take this as a way of saying to all of you that this is what people who do this a lot have come to understand when they walk into a car. And one of the things that you see, and you hear, and just read here, which I really would like you to do very carefully the next time when we ask sign-ups, is page 8 and page 9, which is a facility assessment. When you walk into a Tahara room, it might not be a brand new one, it might be another one. What do you look for? What are you concerned about? Where's the water going to go? Where are the gloves? Where are the sheets? Where's the casket right now? What does the table look like? Are there boards? All of this stuff. So you look for the overview of that. And I want to suggest also that the first part of this hopefully will relieve some of the issues that some of you may have. Because it's got to do with disease acquisition. Can you get something because it's airborne? Can you get something because you've touched the body? Can you get something because you've touched blood? All of these hopefully are answered in here. Now, this is not to say that this is going to give you all the medical information. This is not a medical book. It's a book for people doing Tahara. It's not what goes on in a hospital. It is what goes on in the Tahara room. Although many of the safety precautions that are in here are taken from what hospitals do. Because they have to be safe, we do as well. We may not have to do all of the things that hospitals do, but clearly there are measures that we take that are just as important as what goes on in an ER. And as I said, I really debated a while before we got a hold of these books to give them to you. Because when you read them, when you read it, it's like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, okay. And frankly, if you look at the recommendations and the precautions, the recommendations, the training, immunizations, clothing, personal protective equipment, hand washing, assessing the META or the mate, putting on personal. It shows you how to put on a glove, how to put on any of the if you're wearing masks, if you're wearing whatever. But it'll show you there are pictures for those of us who are linguistically challenged. And in the bottom, from page 17, you can see accidents do happen. That's just the nature of the way it is. So that slips and falls, straining from lifting a mate or meta, that's why we have 3 or 4 people at least on a quarantine. Chemical exposure and exposure to blood and after the Tahara, and you can read all about the stuff that you. And I want to suggest that you read this during the day and not at night. It's not a place where this would go. Okay. If after reading it for the next session, if there are still questions that remain and anxieties, I really would like to hear about them. I want to go back to what we did the first session, which is to talk about some of the anxieties about doing a Tahara in the first place. Now that you've had some experience about both the practical and the theoretical, our hope is that one, those anxieties have calmed down at least a little bit, and two, if there are other ones now that we've created and helped you form, we want to deal with them publicly. They're not private. They're public. Because everybody in every Tahara team deals with this stuff. This booklet just came out recently, last year. And it's really an important book, I think, for 2 reasons. And I told this to one of the authors today. When I said to him, you know, this book is one of the best PR pieces of material that we have for helping people decide to become a member of a Kadisha doing a Tahara. Because all of the anxieties, most, what we know, real ones. What about blood, airborne? What about flood? What about, water on the floor? What do we do with all of that stuff? This booklet handles that. So, on the one hand, it's a technical book to be used later on, obviously. But on the other hand, it's really an important way to understand what goes on in the Tahara room. Any comments, questions?
I was wondering if it ever comes up that you go into do a Tahara with your Chevra and somebody in the Chevra does something or says something that you personally disagree with or don't think is appropriate, etc. I don't know if you want to address it in the room, and I know there's a Roche, but there's also a lot of type A personalities in the world. So is there a way to handle it when something, at least for you, seems to have gone wrong
So in the Tahara room itself, what you say outside the Tahara room is one thing. What you say inside the Tahara room is silence.
Yeah.
The only person that really gets to talk is the person who's the Rosh or the Roshah. They're the boss. So if you, while you're doing a Tahara, sense that, oh, they should have done X and we did Y, you have to hold that till you get out of the room.
I would,
How is that triage? That was really more
Sorry,
my
again?
question is, how is that triage as a group, as a Hevra? How do you triage those concerns amongst yourselves? You
Eh.
know, or maybe it never comes up. You would know better than I would if that situation ever comes up, or if everything is just smooth and harmonious between
What do
everybody.
you mean when you say, how do you triage it?
How do you manage it as a group? You know, I mean.
You're talking
it
about
could be-
after the Tahara?
Yeah, exactly. How do you manage
After
it so that you improve the way that you.
After
that
the
you
Tahara, then,
do-
after the Tahara is, this group, and particularly the rabbis, have to decide what it is, how it is that one is going to do the entire Tahara. What's going to happen before, what's going to happen during, which is what we've been covering, and what's going to happen afterwards. Very often, chevers, when they finish and they've cleaned up and everything is done, they will walk out and get together and say there's some interesting readings that are said often. And often the Rosh or the Roshah will say, any comments about what we did or how we did it?
That was my question.
Yeah, think of it like a debriefing, sort of.
It's like
And
a-
we've
it-
talked
it
about, they
is.
say some prayers, but I think that would be the chance
Yeah.
to have a discussion.
To have the
Or to
discussion.
ask a question of why did we do this, or I've never come across this
Yeah.
situation.
Right.
Or
Right.
like that kind of a thing. Yeah.
Right, you probably also will ask the question, I never saw a mate or a meta who had X or Y or catheter, whatever, and all of that comes out. There's also that briefing before you go into the Tahara room to know what to expect. Not necessarily about the room, because the room you're pretty well familiar with, which is one of the reasons we're going there. But what to expect in terms of the mate or the meta. Did that person die in the hospital? Did they die at home? What kind of condition is the body in? Have the tubes been removed, or do we have to remove the tubes? All of that stuff. Young, old, age, condition, or this condition of the body. Was there organ donation? Because that's
and generally the person running the funeral home will have that information and provide you with that information before you enter the Tahara room.
right. So the one thing you want is that information. The other thing that you want is what? Thank you. The name. The name of the person. Exactly. So and so. Because that's what you need in order to be able to say Mechila at the very beginning.
I would add one slight potential exception to the rule that the Rosh makes all the decisions and you discuss it all afterward, and that is if you see a potential safety hazard. In which case, I think it's appropriate to say to the Rosh, I'm worried about such, and generally what might happen at that point is the whole team will adjourn to an anteroom to discuss the issue and resolve it. But that's not a conversation that takes place in front of the mate.
Right, and then it's lack of respect. if you-
That's right. It's not kavod hamet that, and you walk outside and you do that just the same way that sometimes when you're doing a tahara, there's a question that arises that you're not sure about that the Rosh is not sure about what the answer is. In which case, the Rosh would go outside, call whoever is the posek, the person who makes decisions, and ask for advice. But that too is it's not that common.
So we're gonna talk about, emotional aspects of all of this after the break, and sometimes, the conversation that we're having right now is sort of on the edge of that sometimes. Why did this happen? Why did you decide to do that? Sort of thing. And there are times that, for example, just logistically in terms of the amount of time that one has, where after a Tahara we might part company relatively soon, but agree to get together the next day or talk on the phone or something like that if there's something that we need to process on whatever level that might be. I think that the word that, so we talk a lot about kavod hamet, we also kavod each other, right? Where there's just this fundamental understanding of that we respect one another and we agree that we are all there to respect the deceased, but also to respect one another. In my chevra, we're very nurturing to one another, so like even when we're putting the gowns on, we tie the gowns for each other. When we get to the end of the Tahara, we help each other off with it. So it's this very sort of nurturing, loving, respectful way that we approach everything that we do, and that sets a tone that takes away some of that, tugging and desire to take control of the situation. So a lot of it has to do with setting the tone right up front.
That may be more typical in women's chevras than in men's.
I can't speak to the men's chevra.
Just checking.
So when we complete this process and we've interacted with the maid, is there an obligation, or how often does it happen that members of the Hebra come to the service of the funeral?
Oh, interesting question. Sometimes it really depends on the case by case.
My general understanding around that is if you would have gone to the funeral had you not been part of the Tahari, then you go to the funeral. And if you wouldn't have gone to the funeral had you not, then you don't. That you're going to the funeral is essentially independent. Now, you may feel a greater need or desire to complete the process if you've been part of the Tahara team.
And to hear a eulogy about the person who you just prepared, where you want more information, you want to know more about this person. That might be a way to do it. Yeah.
Is it the custom to essentially that you were involved in someone's heart?
Okay, so let's do that. Anonymity and confidentiality. The question is anonymity and confidentiality, and what is all this thing? In the past, the only way that you could learn how to do a Tahara was by apprenticing. There were no courses, there were no books to read. Certainly the books that we distributed so far in the last 10 years. We're not talking about history here. There may have been books about the liturgy, but that's about it. Everything is transmitted in that room. And so people never knew about the work of a chevra because everything was confidential. Everything. And everything was anonymous, supposedly. The reason I say supposedly is when you have a small community, everyone knows who does what. You try and keep it anonymous. It is totally okay to talk about being in a Chevra Kadisha and what a Chevra Kadisha does. And it's okay to say, I'm one of the people on the men's team. Totally fine. What's not fine is to say, I did a tahara for your father. This is a mitzvah for yourself, and it's not a mitzvah. Should you say, I did a tahara for your father, the relationship between you and that other person would change drastically. So what is permitted is to talk about being part of a chevra, and that has to remain, that's very public. In the past, by the way, it wasn't. Everything was quiet. We're trying to make that much more public about how obviously doing chevra conditions around the country. What's not okay is to talk about the specific. Certainly not about anything that went on in that room. Not only not the name, but also, oh, you know, I did a tahara and here's what it was, and here's what happened. That we don't do. Bruce?
How would you handle a situation where the family
Okay.
comes up to you and says, did you do the tahara for my father? What was it like? I just want to know.
Yes, you can say.
So how would you respond?
Oh, how would I respond? I would say, look, there are about 10 people, 10 men on the tahara team, and that's right. Some of us did that tahara, but it's not really appropriate for us to talk about.
So in that case, then it's okay to say you did it?
No.
Neither confirm nor deny.
What I'm saying is that you would have a whole group of 10.
But I hear him saying he's deflecting it, and the reason is to preserve, even though it's awkward, you want to preserve that relationship.
Yeah, that's right.
Or your own, or for our own.
Yeah, that's right.
Has anyone ever?
There's another piece to this too, which is really interesting that I just came into my awareness fairly recently, where someone was talking about sitting in a congregation. They were saying Kaddish for a parent, and realizing that somewhere in that congregation were the people who had taken care of that tahara, and not knowing who those people were. Next to you, it could have been, it's a little bit like that story about the teacher who had an unruly classroom of kids and finally decided to tell the story of the Lamed Vavniks, and that we actually have one of those Lamed Vavniks in our class, but I'm not at liberty to say who it is. And so, everybody in the class was going, is it me? Is it you? And the behavior in the entire classroom changed. So there's another aspect to this anonymity thing, which is understanding the nature of community on that level.
One quick question. I don't know. I know of cases where people have specifically asked for somebody to be present in the tahara. They want a family member or
Okay, let's talk about, let me do the corollary to this. Family members. A family member comes to you and says, I want to be present, I want to do the tahara, or at least I want to be in that room. It's a very common statement.
family members.
Family members, yeah. It's a very common statement. It's also a very awkward statement. The general rule is that family members do not work on family members.
Doctor's not supposed to operate on a loved one,
But this is even more common. There's a second reason as well. When a family member is in that tahara room with the team, it affects the work of the team. It's not only a question about the individual, but it affects the work of the team.
You could also make the argument that because they're an Ani-Nut, that they're patur from
That's right. You try and do that, yeah.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
part of the.
That's right.
Right, because they're supposed to attend to the deceased in a different. One of the things is that during Ani-Nut, do we talk about Ani-Nut?
Not really.
So Ani-Nut is a period of time from the moment of death till the funeral, till burial is complete, and then it switches to Nikum Avelim, to really comforting the mourners. When a person is an Ani-Nut, one of the immediate family members, they're exempted from doing positive mitzvot, like putting on tefillin or davening in a minyan, because they're supposed to be attending to the needs of making sure that everything is ready to go for the burial itself, which would include tahara. Right? Tahara is a positive time-bound mitzvah. It has to happen at a specific time prior to the burial, once the person has passed away. And so because they're exempted from it, they're actually not supposed to be doing this, supposed to be
So
doing
does
something else.
exempted mean you don't have to?
Doesn't mean
or
they're
you're
not
allowed? 'Cause there's-
No, it doesn't mean that it's a sewer. Doesn't mean that it's prohibited, but there might be some who would argue, in this case.
Yeah.
And we can get into extreme cases of what happens if there's no one else to do the tahara except for a family member. But I don't know if we're going to get into that.
Yeah, that's another issue.
But yeah, so.
Yeah, that's.
So I mean, I
You
guess.
could argue from the legal position as well, that's right.
That's right. There's a route to be able to a family member giving dignity to the deceased is that you have a specific obligation and role to play, which is different from what the Chevra Kedusha is.
Right. Now, by the way, family members can't do shmirah.
That's what I was just
That was
saying.
that was part of it.
That-
Okay,
I
yeah.
was just gonna say that what would be helpful is to understand the motivation, what's behind their desire, because there may be a role other than tahara that fulfills that need
That
that
fulfills
they
that
have.
need, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah, so
One
we
could do
just
that.
direct them to-
There is also a way in which some chevras have actually permitted a family member to come in at the tie the knots. That happens. That is one. I would use that as kind of a last resort. You know, when you finally, when the person says, "I'm doing it," I don't care what you say. You can do that. It's a little tricky because then the person obviously sees who's on the team, but it has all that kind of complications. But that is something that some of the members have been doing. Now, I want to tell you one case that I had, which was really an interesting case, and I'm not sure I handled it right. Probably didn't. But it was a well-versed woman whose mother died, and she came to me and she said, "Stu, I want to do the tahara." And I said, and I gave her all the usual arguments, and she said to me, my mother was there when I was born. I want to be there to help her transition. I had no answer to that. She cared for me when I was born, and I want to help her in this last part of her life. I said, okay. I mean, I couldn't come up with a good argument against it, and she was an extraordinarily strong-willed woman, and that's what I did. Yeah.
I have a friend who's in Hever Kadisha, very Orthodox community. Once the body has been, the person has died, it's been brought to the funeral home, no one sees the body except the Hever Kadisha. And the whole community knows. But there was a young girl who'd been in an accident, and the mother hadn't seen her daughter when she was 8. And the mother really wanted to say goodbye. And this is a community that was very strict about these things, and they said, they let the mother come in prior to doing the tahara. So
Yeah. Right, exactly. There are times when the person's out, the parent or the child, whoever, the mourner is out of town and just wants one last look. wants to say goodbye that way. Yeah.
I want to add one other thing on the subject of anonymity and not discussing. One exception to that is for education for your team, for the whole chevra. So if I am part of a chevra that does a complicated tahara, I may want to talk about the details, perhaps not mention who it was, but here's what happened, here's how we dealt with it, because we all need to learn from each other.
So I've been asking myself how I would feel in the presence of a dead body. And my conclusion is I would be fine. And I had a moment years ago where the parent of a dear friend died in a gruesome car accident. And I went in, and I have not done the car before, and I said to the Kaddish, I'd like to be part of this. And I was ordained at that time, and I said, no, the body's just in such a state that we really witness this or be part of it. And it just made me wonder about cases like that, whether the Tahara team or the Rosh should check in with people about their comfort level in that particular case, or if there have been other cases where you've said maybe we need to think about whether, someone who's fine in general, this might be a different type of case.
It is always that possibility. Also in terms of, we'll talk a little later tonight about cremation, about asking the chevra about that. But there are a lot of cases, a lot of times at which a traditional tahara is not done. So, for example, in the case of somebody where the body is really in bad shape, what's done is the tafrifin are laid on top of the body, and that's it. No water, because water would just disintegrate. I mean, it would just do more damage. There are cases in which, and there are cases in which you would check in with the person, with the people on the team, and ask them, are you okay with this? Are you not okay with this? Transgender is a perfect example of it. We'll talk about that later too. But the issues, checking in with the team is really important in terms of briefing beforehand. In case of murder, for example, one doesn't do it. Just put tafrifin on, and that's it. So there are lots of cases. The other thing is, which everybody here, all of us have to deal with, is are you willing to do a tahara on someone that you know?
It'll happen eventually if you want to have a Kadisha with
It might. Right. Or the opposite, the corollary to that is, I really want to do this for my friend. But it's, again, it's a question of the pre-briefing. And it's not only a question of whether you can do it at 7 o'clock in the morning or whenever. It's a question of who the person is.
And I will add that my experience is that it's a different experience when you do tahara for somebody you knew in life. Not better, not worse, just different.
Very good. Okay.
Should take a break.
One question before we take a break. Is there anyone here who has done a tahara? No, not you. Okay, let's take a break for a few minutes.